I didn't say a word. I just stood there in the doorway of my own dining room, holding a dish I'd spent 3 hours making, while my son-in-law told his friends that I was the help. That was the night everything changed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Gwen. Gwendolyn Marsh, if we're being formal, though nobody's called me that since my mother passed. I turned 63 last February, right in the middle of one of those gray, wet Februaries that make you forget what sunlight feels like. I lived at that point in a 2-story brick house on Elmfield Drive in Oakville, Ontario. My husband Ray and I bought it in 1991. We raised 2 kids in that house. We painted every room ourselves, argued over curtain colors, planted a Japanese maple in the backyard that Ray always said would outlive us both. He was right about a lot of things. He wasn't wrong about that tree either. Ray passed 3 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to goodbye, which is not enough time. There is never enough time, but 6 weeks is particularly cruel. After he was gone, a lot of people assumed I'd sell the house, downsize, move closer to my daughter. But I didn't want to. That house was full of 31 years of a life we built together. The scuff on the baseboard at the bottom of the stairs from the time my son dragged his hockey bag through the door every single winter. The pencil marks on the kitchen door frame where we measured the kids every birthday. The Japanese maple. I stayed. And for about 2 years I was all right. Not happy exactly, but all right. I had my garden, my book club at the Oakville Public Library, a part-time shift at the hospital gift shop on Thursdays and Fridays. I had my daughter, Lee, who called every Sunday evening without fail. I had enough. Lee had been with her husband, I'll call him my son-in-law because that's the only title that matters here, for 4 years before they got married. His name is Scott. Scott Hadley. He's 41, works in commercial real estate, or at least he did. He's the kind of man who walks into a room and immediately starts calculating what he could get for it. I noticed that early. I didn't say anything. You don't say things like that about your daughter's husband. You smile, you pass the potatoes, you hope you're wrong. I was not wrong. It started with what looked like a crisis. Last spring, Scott's business partnership dissolved. Badly, from what I understood. His partner pulled out and took half their client list with him. Within 2 months, Scott and Lee were in real financial trouble. They had a mortgage on a condo in Mississauga, a car lease, a line of credit that had crept up quietly over the years the way those things do. Lee called me on a Sunday, same as always, but this time her voice was different. Tight, controlled the way she sounds when she's trying not to cry. "Mom," she said, "we might need to ask you something." I told her to ask. She asked if they could stay with me for a while. Just until they got back on their feet, 3 months, maybe 4, they'd already spoken to the condo building about breaking the lease early if they could find a subletter. Everything was in motion. They just needed a place to land. I said yes. Of course I said yes. She's my daughter. You don't tell your child no when they're drowning. They moved in on a Saturday in April. I helped them carry boxes. I'd cleared out the spare room. The bigger one, the one that used to be my son's before he moved out to Edmonton, and I put fresh sheets on the bed, left towels on the dresser, made sure there was food in the fridge. I wanted them to feel welcome. I wanted Lee to know her home was still her home the way it always would be. The first 2 weeks were fine. Better than fine, actually. It was nice having someone in the house. Lee and I would have tea in the mornings before Scott woke up. We'd talk about nothing. A show she was watching, something she'd read, the maple coming into leaf. It felt a little bit like before, like those years when the kids were teenagers and the house was loud and full, and I didn't know yet how much I'd miss that noise. Then Scott started settling in. It was small things at first. He moved the coffee table in the living room because he said it was blocking the flow. I didn't say anything. It's a coffee table. I moved it back when he wasn't home, and when he noticed, I just said I preferred it where it was. He nodded and let it go. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. The following week, he asked if he could use the basement as a workspace. I'd used it as a craft room for years. My sewing machine, some shelves of fabric, a small table where I did puzzles in the evenings when I didn't feel like watching television. I said that was fine, as long as he left my things where they were. He agreed. When I went downstairs 2 days later, my sewing machine was in the corner under a drop cloth. My shelves had been pushed against the wall. There was a desk, a monitor, a standing lamp, and a mini fridge down there. It had happened very quickly and very quietly, and Scott acted as though we'd agreed on all of it. I stood at the bottom of those stairs for a long moment. I thought about Ray. Ray would have said something firm and kind the way he always did, and Scott would have understood. But Ray wasn't here and I was the one standing there. I went back upstairs and I said calmly, "Scott, we talked about this. My things stay in the basement." He looked up from his laptop. He had that particular expression he sometimes wore, patient, faintly amused, like I was a child who needed things explained slowly. "Gwen," he said, "I need a proper workspace. I can't run a business from a kitchen chair. I thought you'd understand that." "I do understand it," I said. "And I told you the basement was available to you with my things in it, not instead of my things." He said he'd put them back. He didn't. That weekend, he had a friend come over to help him install a wall mount for a second monitor, and the hole they drilled went right through the paneling Ray and I had put up ourselves in 2003. I started keeping notes, not because I knew things would get bad. I kept notes the way you journal when something feels off, because writing it down makes you feel like you're not losing your mind. I used an old spiral notebook I found in the kitchen drawer, and I wrote down dates and what happened. The coffee table, the basement, the drilled wall. Each time I said something about it, and each time Scott nodded along, and nothing changed. By June, he had started inviting people over regularly. His friends, his former colleagues, men I'd never met who showed up with sports bags and bottles of rye and took over the living room until midnight. I'd come downstairs for a glass of water and find strangers in my kitchen helping themselves to whatever was in the fridge. One of them used my good ceramic casserole dish for chips and left it on the floor beside the couch. I spoke to Lee about it. She looked tired. She always looked tired by then, which I understood. Things were still hard financially. Scott was stressed, and she was trying to hold everything together by being the one who smoothed everything over. She said she'd talk to him. I don't know if she did. Nothing changed. The moment I think about most, when I'm trying to explain how I got to where I got to, was in July. I'd planted tomatoes in the raised bed Ray built along the back fence the summer before he got sick. They were doing beautifully, big, heavy beefsteaks that had been in the family in a way, because Ray had started that bed. I'd kept it going after he died because it made me feel close to him. Simple as that. One afternoon I came home from my Thursday hospital shift to find the raised bed covered in plywood. Scott had laid down boards so he could set up a patio area, a propane fire pit, 4 Muskoka chairs, a string of Edison lights. It was objectively nice, and it was sitting on top of my tomatoes. He'd done it while I was at work. He hadn't asked. He hadn't mentioned it. Lee was sitting in one of the chairs when I came through the back gate, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not guilty exactly, but not comfortable either. I said, "He covered my garden." She said, "He was trying to make a nice space, Mom." I said, "The tomatoes are still under there." She said, "I know." That was the conversation. I went inside and I sat at the kitchen table, and I did not say anything else that night. I wrote it in the notebook. I added it to a number that was growing, because by then I had been tracking the money too. When they moved in, I'd told them I didn't want rent. I wanted them to get back on their feet. That's what I said. But somehow slowly the household expenses had shifted. I was buying most of the groceries. The utilities had gone up with 4 people in the house. Lee worked from home, Scott ran equipment in the basement, and the bills were in my name. I bought new bath towels because Scott's friends had used mine and left them on the bathroom floor in a way that I will not describe in detail except to say they were unsalvageable. When the furnace needed its annual inspection, I paid for it because Scott said he was stretched thin that month and never mentioned it again. I added it up eventually. Over 6 months, I had spent approximately $9,000 more than I would have spent living alone. Not including the damaged paneling in the basement, which I hadn't priced out yet, I had not received $1 from them. Not $1. I'm not telling you this to make Scott sound like a monster. I'm telling you this because this is how it happens. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in coffee tables and drop cloths and plywood boards over your garden, and a furnace inspection that you pay for while your son-in-law orders takeout on his phone. And you let it happen because the alternative is conflict, and conflict means your daughter is caught in the middle, and you love your daughter. But there's a threshold. I hadn't found mine yet. I was still looking for the patient, graceful way through. The dinner was in September. Scott had invited people over, 4 couples, men he knew from his real estate days and their wives. He'd told Lee he wanted to host a dinner to rebuild some professional relationships, which I understood. You have to keep those connections alive when you're rebuilding. Fine. I offered to cook because I'm a good cook and because the kitchen is my kitchen and I wanted to be useful. I made a roast chicken. Real roast chicken with root vegetables and a pan sauce I'd been perfecting for years, and a wild rice salad with toasted pecans and dried cranberries. I also made a butter tart for dessert because this is Canada and some things are non-negotiable. I spent most of Saturday on it. I set the dining table myself, found the good placemats, used the wine glasses that came out of Ray's mother's house in Guelph when she passed. The guests arrived at 6. Scott met them at the door. He was in a blazer, relaxed, laughing. In my house, in my dining room, with my table and my glasses and my food, he was the host. I didn't think too much of it at first. I was still in the kitchen, plating things, warming the sauce. Through the doorway, I could hear him introducing everyone, talking, the particular easy confidence of a man in his element. And then I heard him say, "Oh, don't worry about her. She keeps the place running for us." I stopped moving. I heard one of his friends laugh. I picked up the roasting pan and I walked to the dining room doorway. 8 people at my table, candles lit, wine poured, 8 people looking at me with polite, vague smiles. "She keeps the place running," one of the wives said brightly. "How lovely. How long have you been with them?" I understood what she was asking. She was asking how long I had worked for my son-in-law. I set the roasting pan down on the sideboard. I looked at Scott. He met my eyes for just a moment, and I saw something there, not embarrassment, not shame. He just looked away toward his guests, and he smiled. "Dinner smells amazing," he said to no one in particular. I went back to the kitchen. I stood at the counter. I breathed. I thought about Ray's wine glasses on that table, and Ray's mother who'd carried them from Guelph, and the tomatoes still under the plywood in the yard. I came back out and I served the dinner. I was pleasant and I was quiet, and I thanked everyone when they complimented the food. And when the dinner was over and the guests had gone and Lee was washing up and Scott was finishing the last of someone's wine, I told them both I'd like to meet in the morning. "Is everything okay, Mom?" Lee asked. "I'll see you in the morning," I said. I went upstairs. I got out the notebook. I wrote, September 14. The dinner. I didn't sleep much, but I thought clearly, which is sometimes what sleeplessness is good for. I thought about what I wanted, not what I was owed, not what would punish anyone, but what I actually wanted. And what I wanted was my house back. I wanted my basement and my garden and my kitchen and my table. I wanted to have a Thursday evening without finding strangers in my living room. I wanted to hang a picture on the wall without asking permission in my own home. In the morning, I sat them down at the kitchen table. I'd made tea and I'd made notes. Real notes, the kind I used to make when I was a pharmacist and we needed to document everything properly. I had dates, I had dollar amounts, I had a list of changes made to the property without my knowledge or consent. I had a phone number for a contractor friend of mine who told me the basement repair would cost $1,100. Scott looked at the papers on the table. He looked at Lee. He looked back at me. "Gwen," he said, "I think you might be overreacting a little. I have a proposal," I said. "You can have until November 1st to find alternative housing. That's 6 weeks. That's fair notice by any standard. I will not charge you for the time you've been here. I will not take any of this further as long as the repairs are made before you leave." "You're kicking us out?" Lee said. Her voice broke a little on the last word. "I'm asking Scott to leave," I said. "I'm asking you to make a choice." That's the part that was hard to say, the part I'd written down and rewritten and lost sleep over, because I knew what I was asking. I was asking my daughter to choose, and that is not a thing a mother wants to do. But I was also 70% certain I already knew what she would choose, and I was right about that the way Ray was right about the maple tree. Lee looked at her husband. She looked at me. She said, "I think we should talk about this, Scott." He said, "There's nothing to talk about. Your mother is being completely unreasonable." She said, "She told you to leave her sewing machine where it was." It was quiet for a moment, a real quiet. "She told you not to cover the garden," Lee said. "I told you not to cover the garden." He started to say something and she held up her hand. "We'll start looking," she said to me. "I'm sorry, Mom." Scott left that table without another word. I heard him go downstairs and I heard the mini fridge open and close. Lee and I sat there. She said, "I knew it was going wrong. I just didn't know how to." She stopped. I should have said something sooner. "Yes," I said, and then, "I know." I called my contractor friend that week. He repaired the paneling for $900 because he'd known Ray. Scott wrote the check without looking at me when I handed him the invoice. They were gone by the 28th of October, 3 days before the deadline, which I think tells you something about the particular pride of a man who needs to feel like he left on his own terms. The morning after they left, I took my sewing machine out of the corner and set it up at the table where it belonged. I made tea. I opened the back door and I looked at the plywood over the raised bed. It was October and the season was done, but there might be a few plants still viable underneath. Sometimes tomatoes hang on longer than you'd expect. I started pulling the boards up one by one. There was nothing left to save. But the soil was there, dark and good, the way Ray had built it. I'd put in kale in spring, maybe herbs, maybe whatever I felt like. I went back inside and I called my daughter. She answered on the second ring. "Mom," she said. "Good morning," I said. "I'm making tea. Tell me how you are." It took her several months to tell me everything, all of it, the way things had been with Scott before they'd moved in with after. There had been a family lawyer involved by December, and by March she'd filed. I didn't tell her what to do. I didn't have to. She'd made her own list, her own notes. I don't know when she started writing things down. Maybe sooner than I knew. The legal matters sorted themselves out slowly, the way they do. There's not much drama in the paperwork of a marriage ending. There's just time and waiting, and the occasional phone call from her lawyer, who was very efficient and very tired sounding, the way lawyers often are. What I can tell you is that by the following spring, Lee was in a rental apartment in Oakville, 15 minutes from me. And on a Saturday in May, we drove to a garden center together, and she helped me pick out tomato seedlings for the raised bed. Beefsteaks, because that's what Ray always liked. She carried the flat to the car, and we drove home with the windows down. She helped me plant them. We were in the yard for 2 hours, kneeling in the dirt, talking about nothing important. The maple was putting out new leaves. The sun was doing that particular late afternoon thing it does in Ontario in May, low and golden and almost too much. Lee sat back on her heels and looked at the bed. "Dad would be annoyed we didn't mulch yet," she said. "He would have done it himself and not said a word," I said. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that has something else underneath it, but it was real and it was hers. We went inside and I made supper, and she stayed, and we ate at my table in my dining room with Ray's mother's wine glasses because we felt like it. My house was mine again. My daughter was home. That's the whole story. I don't know what else to tell you, except that I wish I'd spoken sooner, not because it would have saved the marriage, but because it would have saved me 8 months of a notebook I wish I hadn't needed to keep. If someone is treating your home like a hotel they don't pay for, you are allowed to say something. You are allowed to be clear. Love does not require you to disappear. I'm 64 now. The tomatoes are doing beautifully. The maple is fine.